Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to another video. If you haven't been to my channel before, my name's Josh. And today's video topic was sort of a special request that I got from an email from somebody who wanted me to reshare my story of going through my depression and my grief that I had back when I was living in Sedona. So I mentioned it in a previous video, and I talked about a time in my life where a good friend of mine passed away, my grandmother passed away, and then I had suppressed grief from my own father's passing back when I was about 9 or 10 years old. So I'm sure I stuffed a lot of that grief, because what 9 or 10-year-old boy knows how to truly process grief, as an emotion. So I knew I got some crying out back then, but I'm sure I stuffed a lot of it. So anyways, fast forward to the Sedona days. A very good friend of mine, he was kind of like a father figure to me. He was my best friend's father. He took his own life, and I got a random phone call one day, telling me about it and how he did it and stuff like that, and that triggered this whole stack of grief. And then I lost my grandmother, who I was really close with, shortly after that. So this sort of triggered this massive grief, and I didn't really know how to process the grief. So the grief turned into depression because I wouldn't allow myself to cry. So what happened, to kind of retell the story, the grief turned into depression, and in those days in Sedona, I was working at Doc's Ranch, volunteering for Veritas Publishing, and a good friend of mine, her name, what she did, she was a state psychologist. So she was down there volunteering with me one day, and she's the one that sort of noticed that I was in depression. And it's kind of funny how people around you or people close to you notice that you're depressed before you even realize you're actually depressed, because depression in the beginning is sort of like denial. It's like, something's bothering you, you're sad, something's not right, but you're sort of in denial still that you're actually depressed. So she spotted out that I was depressed, and she's like, well, Dr. Hawkins is right inside, so let's go talk to him. So I was like, okay, cool. Well, so we went inside and sat down with Doc. And I told Dr. Hawkins my story about what was going on with me, that, a couple people in my life passed away and so forth. And what I recall, I sat down with him, I was sitting there in his living room chatting with him. And I just recall that he wasn't really interested in the story. He was only really interested in how to remove the arrow in my skin, you might say. That's sort of like a analogy from Buddhism, that if you get shot with a poison arrow, then the naive person will spend their whole life searching for the person who shot the arrow, but the Buddha is only interested in how to remove the arrow itself. So he seemed very focused on just how, what it was that I needed help with, and wasn't really energizing the story. And he said, yeah, you just need to get on an antidepressant briefly, because your brain chemistry is probably a little tweaked from from grief and depression. And once I get on an antidepressant briefly, the brain chemistry will correct itself and I'll be totally fine. So he was like, if I was still in practice right now, I would write you a prescription, but I don't have my license anymore. So just go see, a nurse practitioner, and she'll set you up, with something. And then I remember walking out of his house and him turning to me and looking at me and saying something like, you realize how much God loves you, right? And so that was kind of like the extent of the interaction. And then I went and eventually saw a nurse practitioner, got on an antidepressant called Wellbutrin, because what I struggled with was energy. I struggled getting out of the house and doing things. I was totally capable of going to work, but it was hard, like on my days off, to like really get motivated to go outside and do stuff. So, you sit down with a nurse practitioner, you go through like a whole checklist of things and questions, and she decided that the one suited for me was Wellbutrin. And it worked fantastic. It got me out of the house. It made me want to like go do things constantly. And so what the antidepressant does, in my own experience, and according to Dr. Hawkins, he says to do everything you can physically, mentally, and spiritually to recover from any sort of ailment. And that's also taught in A Course in Miracles. So being a devout student of Dr. Hawkins and A Course in Miracles, of course I'm going to do exactly what he says, which is everything physically, mentally, and spiritually. And if you cover all three of those territories, your success rate is almost 100%. Now the only thing that would keep it from being 100% is some sort of karmic factor. But that again is something that you can only surrender to God ultimately. So anyways, I went and saw the nurse practitioner. I was going to a psychologist who was a preacher, a local minister, and I was going to counseling for her. So she really helped me to uncork that grief and really helped allow me to cry it all out. Because I finally realized that letting go of grief and allowing oneself to cry are the same thing. So if you find yourself stuck in some sort of grief, the thing to do is to really allow yourself to have a good cry, and allow it to come up whenever it needs to. If you feel that energy of cryingness needing to come up, go find a place, a quiet room by yourself, and just allow yourself to have that good cry, because the more you cry, the more you're uncorking that grief and letting it go. And then eventually, as you keep crying, you become more and more at peace with the situation of, the people that passed in your life. So I was getting therapy from a local priest. I went to a nurse practitioner and got on an antidepressant, and then I had the good fortune of getting to sit down with Dr. Hawkins and him giving me some advice on how to handle the situation. Plus, I was friends with that state psychologist, and she allowed me to come over and chat with her anytime I wanted to. So I was extremely blessed. When I think back to like my karma, I must have had fantastic karma to have 4 people like that at the palm of my hand. And so I want to talk about what the antidepressant did for me, because one of the person that asked me to do this video was sort of curious of what the antidepressant did for me. And my own experience, so when I take an antidepressant, I'm not going to do anything else with it. I'm not going to drink alcohol. I'm not going to do any drugs. I was an extremely devout spiritual student, so my intention was dead set on recovering from this depression. So the antidepressant sort of was like the hand of God underneath my feet. It was like the hand of God was constantly underneath me and keeping my consciousness from falling deeper into this black hole. So the antidepressant is sort of like this gift from, it's like a grace of God, like underneath my feet, that's giving me the necessary energy and comfort and cushion to then allow me to work on myself spiritually and physically to the best of my ability. I was going to the gym, I was doing the Course in Miracles, I was using the Sedona method, I was using Doc's letting go technique. I was, doing all the various principles that I normally use from Dr. Hawkins. And so I was doing everything I possibly could physically and mentally and spiritually to overcome this depression. So, I think it is possible to recover from such things only using the spiritual. So like if I would have just used the letting go technique or surrender as Doc describes it, I probably would have recovered. But I think it possibly could have taken longer. So I think the benefit of covering everything physically, mentally, and spiritually is that the success rate is just a little quicker. So, why make yourself suffer in the meantime when you could sort of take care of all 3 things at the same time? So to do everything physically, mentally, and spiritually sort of provides you with instant relief, and at the same time you're still working on yourself. So I was on Wellbutrin for about a year and a half, and then what happened was one afternoon I had this intense attachment come up at work, and I was dating this girl at the time, and we talked about separating and splitting, and this severe attachment feeling in my solar plexus arose that morning. And I worked a 10-hour shift, so the whole 10-hour shift I just applied Doc's letting go technique. So I kept my focus of attention on this sensation, this feeling in my solar plexus in my gut, and I didn't allow a single moment of distraction to shift my focus of attention from that feeling. So after doing that for about 10 hours that day at work, right before it was time to go home, the feeling let go, and this consciousness went into like almost a state of ecstasy. I went into like an ecstatic state of, a very high joy, borderline ecstasy. And it was that moment when all depression ceased, and I just naturally dropped the antidepressant medication all by myself without, I didn't go back to the nurse practitioner. There was like an inner knowingness that I was healed, and I was in that state of like verging on ecstasy for almost like 3 days. And there was a couple realizations in that space. I remember seeing that nothing outside of myself needed to be changed or controlled, and that the only thing that needed healing was my own perception of the world. So the world is absolutely perfect at all times as it is, and the only thing that needs to be healed is our perception of the world, how we perceive the events, how we perceive various situations. And I saw that all that needed to be done was to let go of resisting whatever feeling that I was having in each unfolding instant. So the depression healed all by itself, and then it never came back. A couple of years later, I did have a best friend of mine pass away in a car accident that I was good friends with for over 25 years. And that triggered the grief again. But at this time, I knew how to process the grief. I knew how to allow myself to cry. Every time I felt that crying energy come up, I would just look at pictures of him and allow myself to have that good cry. And every time I allowed myself to have that good cry, I would be in a state of peace after it. So this is just sort of a retelling of my story. Let me see if I have these questions right here that I wrote down. Yeah, so I had these questions that the person that sent me this email was curious about. The first question was, what kind of medication was I on? I was on Wellbutrin, and it was an antidepressant. Question number 2, how did it supplement me in letting go? So like I said, it supplemented me in letting go by providing like this hand of God cushion underneath my feet at all times. So I was sort of like lifted, like floating on a cloud. And that cloud gave me the necessary energy and the willingness to apply spiritual principles relentlessly, and to get me out of the house to, do things physically, whether it was hiking, working out, going to spiritual groups, or whatever it was. So handle everything you can physically, mentally, and spiritually to recover and to have a, close to 100% success rate. Question number 3. What was Doc's take on why I needed medication instead of just relying on surrender and letting go alone? So again, I think he realized that, Doc, being a psychiatrist for 50 years, he views antidepressants as sort of a, part of the evolution of mankind and coming out of the 400s. So it comes out of the intellect and reason, and it's really a gift to mankind, antidepressants, for decades, for centuries. Mankind just struggled with depression, and it wasn't until very recently that we developed antidepressants, and antidepressants really gives the opportunity to people to live a much better life for themselves, Now, the only thing I differ on is that probably the majority of people, take antidepressants forever because they've got no interest in spirituality or working on themselves, self-improvement or whatever. But in a situation, if you're a devout spiritual student and you're working on yourself relentlessly as it is, if you take an antidepressant for something, I think your success rate is 100%. I don't think you're going to have to be on such a medication very long. So, like Doc said, he said all that needed really to be corrected was I had a little tweak in my brain physiology, my brain chemistry, and once I took that antidepressant and those neurotransmitters reconnected properly, I would recover automatically. But Doc, I have heard Doc say that you can do such a thing without taking medication. It's possible, but I think it could take longer. So why suffer longer when you could sort of do everything you can physically and mentally, spiritually right from the get-go? Question number 4, how does one know that letting go is not enough to overcome a hardship? That's kind of a subtlety, really. I mean, I use tons of spiritual techniques when I'm struggling with something. I use letting go, I use surrender, I repeat Psalm 91. I surrender my will in the matter. I pray, I sort of pray up a storm. I use the Course in Miracles. I like to read spiritual literature, the Upanishads or something of very high calibration when I'm going through something that's challenging, because it sort of reignites that spiritual inspiration and really helps me get over whatever bump that I'm currently dealing with. So, I don't rely on letting go or surrender alone. I usually use a half a dozen techniques all simultaneously. And, that combined with doing everything physically, mentally, and spiritual, my success rate is 100%. And I will say that I like the serenity prayer a lot. There's been times in my life where I've used the serenity prayer. And, if you repeat that kind of all throughout the day, it's pretty amazing what sort of, what kind of almost a state of serenity overcomes you, sort of a profound acceptance of what is. Because so many of our issues really come from wanting to change things, control things, or resist things. And if you really see that all your problems in life come from those 3 things, it becomes really quite simple. Question number 5, when did I know it was time to get off the meds again? Like I said, that was sort of arose spontaneously. You know, I went into a state of almost verging on ecstasy. And there was just sort of an intuitive awareness, like a knowingness that I was healed and no longer needed the medication. And I dropped it all by myself and never went back to it. Now, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't use it again if I had to. But, yeah, so that spiritual experience that happened as a consequence of letting go of that severe attachment for about, 8 to 10 hours that day, and then going into that almost ecstatic state, that was it, and I was healed from that. So anyways, that's pretty much everything I think I could share on this topic, but I wanted to do this video for the person that asked for me to do this video, and then just for other people that were curious again to rehear this story. So thanks again, guys, for listening. Hope you're enjoying your day, and I'm gonna do another video here very soon. So look forward to sharing more stuff with you guys. All right, take care. Bye.